Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. We're excited to announce that registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA is officially open. Beginning September 22nd, this 9-month facilitated learning journey was created for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with over 350 different social enterprises, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy and dive into key business principles from a regenerative and equity-centered lens, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement to create a world that works for all of us. Interested in learning more? Join us for a free intro session where you can meet course facilitators and hear from our amazing alumni to determine if this course is a fit for you. Plus, save 20% on tuition when you register before August 3rd during our early bird sale. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening. And now on to the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, my name is Erin Axelrod. I'm a worker, owner, and partner at Lift Economy. And I am so thrilled in the spirit of World Localization Day to have Helena Norberg-Hodge, linguist, author, filmmaker, and leader of the New Economy movement. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures, and based on decades of experience in indigenous cultures, in particular Ladakh and Bhutan, Helena has been promoting a big picture understanding of the foundations of human as well as ecological well-being. Her work has gained her the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Arthur Morgan Award, and the Goy Peace Prize. Helena is author of the inspirational classic Ancient Futures, Local is Our Future, and producer of the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness, Planet Local, and Closer to Home. Helena, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
It is such an honor to get to know you a little bit deeper through these podcasts because I've been following your work for so many years. And I'd love for our listeners to hear from you how it was that you came to this work, the leadership that you have around rethinking our economic systems has been so profoundly moving to me. So thank you for everything you've done. Please share a little bit about your journey.
Well, I also just want to thank you and to say how thrilled I've been to learn about what you're doing. It's just so clear to me that the most important thing we need to focus on is this systemic shift of the economy. And that became clear to me when I ended up in a remote part of the world that hadn't been affected by the global economic system, that has actually been transforming life on Earth for a few hundred years now. And I was given this extraordinary opportunity and, in a way, responsibility, because I had this rare experience of ending up in a part of Tibet called Ladakh. It's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And this rather large area, about the size of Austria, with about 100 villages spread out in a high-altitude desert, a very difficult part of the world, snowed in for 8 months of the year, barren desert, and yet a flourishing community and economy. And people there had over, as far as we know, thousands of years adapted to this very specific and difficult ecosystem. And they were remarkably wealthy. They had 3-story houses. There was no hunger. There was no unemployment. There was none of the pollution that we're familiar with. And most of the illnesses that we take for granted, like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, also not there. So it was, in a way, almost a paradise. Most women who arrived in the early years, and I'm talking now the mid-70s, when this place was opened to the outside world, kept saying, "Oh, I feel like I must have been here in another lifetime. I just feel like I'm coming home." There was this pervasive sense of peace and security, a very feminine culture, which superficially might not be so obvious because it was Tibetan Buddhism that was the dominant religion. And so we had these monasteries inhabited primarily by monks. But people who just came in from the outside didn't realize that the real power was with the household and was with the farmers who actually produced what people need. And I found that in that very decentralized, localized, land-based way of living, that women had a lot of influence and power. In fact, I would say after many, many years out there, that they had more real power than women in Sweden, where I grew up. And that's often held up as one of the more egalitarian societies in the Western world. But in real terms, the voice of women counted. And not only that, I discovered that here people had so much time to do what they really needed to do and wanted to do, whether it was caring for children, caring for the animals, for the land, for themselves, singing, dancing, able to develop multiple skills. Everybody knew how to do everything from weaving to building a house to growing food to looking after children. So even a 6-year-old boy was a reliable child care person so that every mother had about 5 to 10 caretakers for every child. The most important thing of all was I discovered that with this abundance of time and with a structure that was human scale, where people had an intimate relationship with the people whom they depended on and with the land and the animals and the water and the trees on which they depended. With those closer relationships, there inevitably was much more accountability and responsibility. Seeing that the changes that came when it was opened up to the global economy is what drove me to become 24/7 activist about raising awareness throughout the world about the need to change the dominant globalizing economy, where giant global corporations and banks were beginning to dominate our governments, our worldview, in every aspect of the worldview, from science to the media to schooling and culture, that for-profit corporations were shaping our lives in a way that was so clearly destructive, that was so clearly creating more competition, more, maybe most importantly of all, more unhappiness. I started seeing this epidemic of depression and insecurity among young people in particular. And this all motivated me to spend every part of the year traveling and trying to share a holistic understanding of the global economic system while arguing for more decentralized or localized structures. So this was from 1975 onwards I've been doing this.
Finding this experience of deep-seated grief coming up as you share this, and almost surprise, like how is it possible that these intact cultures that you've been able to witness, that I've been able to see glimpses of through work with Indigenous communities in the U.S., surprised that it's not self-evident and obvious that we would return to those and relinquish the dominant paradigm of war and militarism. And I'd be curious to hear your response of, have you found in your work that it's helpful to root our conversations in, like, how did we get here?
I definitely think it's so important to understand how we got here and how it is that till this day, so many people are not seeing what's going on. And you know the story about the frog in water. And I often give the analogy of the aunt who goes away for 6 months and then comes back and says to her sister and her nephew, who's, say, 16. So she's saying, oh my God, he's grown. In 6 months, oh my God, half a foot. And the mother, who's been buying new clothes and who's sort of very aware that he's grown, has not seen it in that same dramatic and clear way. And so I think in my case, every year being in a part of the world that wasn't affected so dramatically by the global consumer culture and then coming back to the West gave me greater clarity about the changes. And that meant both the negative and the positive. So to this day, I feel, I think, more hopeful and more optimistic than many of my colleagues of my age. I have, as it happens, I became such a passionate spokesperson for systemic change already in the mid-70s. And I actually got to know some of the most wonderful leaders in the social and environmental movement, many in America, all over Europe, also later Japan and Korea. And I wrote a book that came out in the late 80s called Ancient Futures. And I got such overwhelming positive feedback from all over the world, from more than 40 language groups. And they all said, the story you're telling of Ladakh is our story too. So that gave me a mandate to keep on saying what I had already started saying in the 70s, even though what I was seeing was coming back to the West was that many of my colleagues who in the 70s were on the same page. There was a sort of almost universal clarity about the need for two major shifts, both systemic. There was a demand for change to science, a demand starting with wise leaders like Rachel Carson, who was pointing out that science was already too reductionist, a science that believed it's fine to create some DDT to kill the insects we don't like, without recognizing that we were harming ourselves and other wildlife. And there was a demand for decentralization. And that was really the foundation of the environmental movement. But then over the years, as the corporate world became more wealthy and more powerful, and as they started funding conferences, studies, research, and funding many environmental groups, the emphasis shifted towards treating symptoms instead of looking at this central need for a really structural and fundamental change to the economic system. Now these winners, these global deregulated corporations that as a structure are very dangerous because they are a blind machine just pressured by shareholders to keep growing and growing, and blind machines. So I, on the other hand, was going away and coming back, and I was seeing that these giant corporations were, at the same time as they were influencing the environmental movement in the West, they were moving into the so-called poor countries to now benefit from so-called cheap labor, which meant going into poor countries where they could employ people at a much lower rate. And they ended up lobbying and supporting an environmental movement that in the West was saying, in poor countries, they shouldn't need to reduce emissions so quickly. In these poor countries, they should have much more time. It's in the rich countries that we need to reduce emissions. So this became a very dangerous, very, very dangerous situation where people in the West were blindly supporting that ability for global corporations to move away from America or Germany into India, China, Indonesia, with plenty of cheap labor and plenty of fossil fuels and no restriction on emissions. And this has been the tragic development over the last 30, 35 years. And now I think, we're reaching a point where there's a wake up for the need for real stepping back to look at the cause of the polycrisis. And I'm also just want to stress that our work is very much about international collaboration, international cultural exchange, because actually what's been happening is that we are less well informed about what's going on the other side of the world than we were back in the 70s and 80s. And, part of that was that we were not all running around like headless chickens in the 70s and 80s, the way we are now. That meant, for instance, that people in my generation had the time to go and travel between school and university and to actually have a deeper experiential knowledge of what was happening in so-called poor countries. And we had people, for instance, in the United States who joined the Peace Corps and would spend sometimes years in villages in Africa or India, and who had a much deeper understanding of what was going on. Whereas in this time of the internet, when we think we have so much information, we've actually been cut off more and more, and we're dependent on very speedy, reductionist, soundbite knowledge, which is extremely dangerous. So this is why I think it's so important that you have a regular podcast and that you're supporting, a deeper and broader systemic look at the economic system, because it turns out it really is so much about what's in our heads. It's not so much about values. It's actually about shifting our understanding of what's actually going on. And I just want to add also that I feel very privileged to know from experience that the people in the corporate world who pushed this fragmented worldview of, let's not have any restrictions on emissions in the so-called poor country, these were not evil people. Now, they include Al Gore, whom I met briefly, and Maurice Strong, whom I knew quite well. It wasn't evil, narrow greed. It was actually being educated into an econometric worldview that was simply not based on the reality of what was going on the ground. And that's what we need now more than ever. And that it's very helpful to know that it's really not so much about good guys and bad guys as it is about real experiential knowledge linked to theory. And to get that with a global perspective, we have to look carefully to find the people who really have that deeper knowledge, and we have to listen to voices that we normally are not going to get in the main institutions of power.
Thank you so much for naming everything that you shared. One thing that struck me was acknowledging that people in positions of power that you have come across have made decisions that are not rooted in they themselves being evil people, but that the structures that they're beholden to and embedded in are causing these destructive decisions to carry out.
Exactly. And key with that is whether you're a CEO or whether you're a relatively impoverished consumer, almost anywhere in the world today, you have no idea what your impact is on other people, on the water, on the soil, on the living world, because the distances are too great, the speed is dramatic, and this is why we must decentralize, shorten those distances to start creating systems. Whether you're a consumer or a CEO, you have an awareness of your impact, and where the feedback loops force you to be aware, and that also leads to an accountability and a visibility that in and of itself doesn't guarantee ethical behavior, but it's a prerequisite for it.
We talk a lot in our MBA program, and we do an exercise early on in the first 6 sessions around a bioregional cup of tea, and how do we redesign tea so that it is more decentralized, whether that be growing a tea garden on every block. And one of the tensions that comes up is the legacies of repair that are needed to restore ecosystems that have been exploited in, as you said, the so-called poorer countries. I love how you framed it, the so-called, right? Because we know that there's affluence beyond financial wealth in those communities. And so I guess I'm curious if you have examples where you've seen relocalization efforts that have happened that also taking into account this need to reinvest, redistribute wealth back to communities that have been exploited from.
Yeah, although I want us to rethink that a bit. The wealth that was created from the very outset of the modern economy was always extracting wealth upwards. And it's really important that we understand from the beginnings of this global system, which started already in the 1400s as Europeans expanded across the world, robbing other cultures of their resources, and often with the help of Christianity, subjugating them intellectually to believe that their worldview and their religion was inferior. And it was led by people who were overtly racist, who were overtly misogynist, and also believed that nature had to be tortured for her secrets. Very importantly, we need to recognize that those were the roots. But as that system developed, even in the early days, it had collaboration from elites in the so-called poor countries. So whether India or Indonesia or other parts of the world, elites benefited by being able to offer very cheap labor into the global marketplace. So there was a certain wealth creation there too, and pretty soon that system became global. So it wasn't a question of just white Westerners pushing this, and which is very important today, that we move away from a politics of identity and think, white men are the problem. And this globalized system drove people away from the land. And when we were driven away from the land, whether through enclosures in Europe or through slavery on the other side of the world, what was destroyed was a fabric of interdependence with which we had evolved. We would never have evolved. We would not have developed our sort of human traits without being interdependent. And it was intergenerational interdependence, living in groups where we needed one another in order to make the task of living off the land, dealing with building our houses, providing for our needs. We needed one another. As we were pushed away from that interdependence with others, we were pushed into urban centers where we now depended on elites that we didn't even know the name of, far removed elites, and now suddenly it was all elbows with others. So what was forged was with relationships of fear and competition. I was fascinated to see in Ladakh and later in Bhutan and also even in rural villages in Spain, how even in the 80s, the transformation of the economy led to a breakdown of intergenerational connections going into the city. And when you were in the city and you depended on money for everything you needed, and you had no idea who was controlling that marketplace, no idea how much bread or milk would cost tomorrow, of course, your natural response was going to be to hoard money. That was an absolutely natural and sensible reaction. So again, I feel I've seen structural reasons why people at the grassroots became greedier. I've seen structural ways that the elites also kept getting more and more greedy and more locked into, we have to get big to survive, and getting big was never big enough. You've got to merge to survive. And so whether it was a small farmer in India or ExxonMobil merging, we were getting locked into this deadly path of speedier and speedier growth and competition, and all of it fear-based and not even structurally allowing for collaborative structure. So anyway, I do think it's incredibly important to understand this system better. once you see it more clearly, and then you, as I, have been involved in trying to encourage that people rebuild the fabric of community and rebuild their connections to nature and do it as a community initiative. And you see all around the world in various ways these things, ongoing attempts, and often led by women, and so beautiful and so inspiring, and often able to demonstrate multiple benefits, and often restoring land that's been raped by the chemicals, the machinery that was imposed on us. And now we just human care and maybe a few animals, land that was barren and dead in a few years, flourishing, while people were flourishing. People who suffer from depression, from addiction, prisoners. So those small-scale, multiple initiatives, some of which get squashed and often operate under conditions that are so difficult, but they keep popping up. And so for me, it's the constant demonstration of the human desire for connection, the human need to rebuild that community fabric and connection to nature. So I feel nurtured and hopeful and convinced that in the long run, life will prevail and the human need for connection will prevail. But I'm very keen that we work to make it more possible and make more people aware both of the destruction of the dominant system without blaming particular people or countries or corporations, have clarity about that, but also vigilant observation and support for and documentation of the multitude of positive initiatives that are growing around the world. And that's what World Localization Day is about, which is why I'm so happy that you're willing to celebrate that with us.
It's incredible. I feel like in so-called United States, Turtle Island, we've inherited a much more reductionist version of the local movement, unfortunately. And thank you for giving so much beautiful nuance to what you mean by that transition. It's actually quite relieving to hear that it is such a complex transition we're talking about. I love that you described it as moving beyond identity politics. And I wanted to bring in, there's a woman who we had on the podcast named Julia Watson, who studies Indigenous communities and is doing a lot of work to bring forward Indigenous technologies that she's been studying for many years as well.
I love her book, Low Tech. We should promote it. I love it. Yes. I've talked to her and would like to collaborate with her. Yeah. There's all these collaborators standing by. If you could wave a magic wand, what would happen on World Localization Day, and how would this campaign, this initiative, amplify the work that has to happen that is existential for humans to stay on this planet? More than anything, absolutely, would be an explosion in awareness, and that would start with understanding that, sadly, structurally, the big money is shaping the media, and it's shaping it into ever more reductionist sound bites that shy away from any genuine systemic light on where we need to go. So we have everything from HSBC Bank to most supermarket chains, Walmart, all advertising local. But anything that is actually about a systemic shift to genuinely local structures, because we're not talking about a local farm or a local business. Everything is local in that way. We're talking about systemic connection from the seed to the plate. We're talking about that beautiful thing that happens when communities come together and support the businesses they want. Whether it's a hardware store or whether it's a shop they love of some other kind, or a restaurant or a farm, when they come together and fund that and support it, because that's what their community needs. We have wonderful examples of what can happen. But that That is something that we do not get to hear about in the media. Recently, we had a breakthrough in Sweden where we had in the biggest newspaper a double-page spread and a real voice for what we're talking about, and it's led to an explosion of interest. And I know that that's what would happen if we can get out more widely. So this is my big hope for World Localization Day, that people like you who reach others make it clear there is so much more happening than we know about, but we need to understand the systemic and structural underpinnings and understand, again, it's not a politics of identity. It's not about good guys and bad guys, but it's literally about good structures and bad structures. It's about scale. It's about speed. It's about clearly seeing that across the board, the majority of people would prefer to have their government subsidize food without chemicals, support their local farmers and their local shops. They don't want our taxes to be subsidizing global corporations that don't pay tax and that have no rules. So my big hope for World Localization Day is that the message will get out that there is a globalizing path that is so destructive. It's anti-life because these giants support monoculture. They can support neither ecological diversity nor cultural diversity, nor any form of genuine democracy. So we're in a very dangerous situation structurally, and we need to be clear about what is the systemic path that's continuing to take us in that direction, and how can we have clarity and a strong voice to support the direction that without a doubt the majority of people want. And, if you look all around the world, what's the most important thing that people talk about on their deathbed? Remember, we're talking about mechanisms that governments on both left and right have been using. Subsidies, first of all, taxes. What do they tax? What do they subsidize? And what do they regulate? Those mechanisms are shaping our future, shaping our society, and yet both left and right have been taking us in the same direction. Bigger and bigger, faster and faster, more and more global, no oversight, no democratic accountability. And that's what needs to shift politically. But in the meanwhile, there is a huge amount that can be done and that is being done even before we shift politically. But let's keep our eye on both. And I'm so glad that you're doing that in LIFT, both addressing the community initiatives as well as the political initiatives that are needed.
Speaking of which, there is Shareable is a key strategic partner of ours, and they are launching in June a toolkit of the Library of Things movement that they're spearheading, teaching people how to create libraries where people can get the resources they need without even have to pay for it. Free access to not just tools or books, but things that we use every day. And that leads me to, I'd love to talk with you about, where do you see the role of gift economy initiatives in this and actually helping equip people to move away from reliance on financial currency?
Well, I worry about pressuring people to move that way in a system where it's virtually impossible to survive without being part of the money economy. But I think we need to distinguish between the longer term vision and what we all would like versus what can we do right now. And there I have found that the attempts to build up gift economy systems, the attempt to start local currencies, which we ourselves also did, they basically haven't worked, even when they received support like our close friend who was the mayor of the city of Bristol in the UK, which has about 500,000 people. When they brought in from the local government a Bristol pound, I thought, well, maybe now it can work. But no, it hasn't. And so I want people to be aware of that there is a whole history here of attempts, and to be strategic and to learn from what's been tried and what hasn't worked. And what's really wonderful is that in many of the projects you were talking about, like with repair cafes and also tool libraries and all kinds of swap shops and so on, they have worked even though they haven't relied on just the gift economy or an alternative currency, because they can so rapidly bring down the price, they can so rapidly prevent all the problems with built-in obsolescence, and they can have a huge beneficial effect. And I'm particularly keen that people realize that there is really nothing more fundamental when it comes to the economy in terms of, what do we humans produce that we need and that is then distributed. There is nothing more important than the food economy. And there, in terms of a worldwide local food movement, we've seen this again and again, and in, dozens of countries, that using the national currency can work fine. But it's the key about bringing together the consumer and the farmer. And part of building up that movement is also to focus on what the 99.9% of people need to do. In other words, the consumers, because in most of the world now, the largest proportion is the urban dweller, and the farmers are being destroyed very, very quickly. And it's an absolute alarm bell. It's the single most important thing to focus on, is how we can rebuild healthy food economies. It's a way to restore wildlife. It's about restoring healthy food, reducing plastic, climate emissions. It's a win-win-win that's remarkable. And it can be done right now using the national currency. And it brings this beautiful collaboration, often between left and right, often between farmers who've been trained to believe that more chemicals are needed and often have a different political perspective, with more green and left-leaning consumers, and their conversations and their mutual support with one another is building this demonstration that ultimately we all want the same thing. And here we are practically building in interdependence between left and right, between more ecological and less ecological, and between people of all kinds of different races and backgrounds. That is, the most beautiful example of all of how things can work.
Helena, thank you so much for taking the time to share so much wisdom with our listeners. As we bring our conversation to a close, is there anything else you'd like to share about World Localization Day, how people can get involved?
Yeah, well, I'd love people to come to our website, localfutures.org. They could also look at our new campaign in Sweden, which has a separate website called therealeconomy.earth. And above all, join World Localization Day, which can help you to perhaps do something simple, like just organize a meal with some friends where you eat primarily local food and also become more familiar with the multiple social, environmental, and economic benefits of supporting a more localized food economy. And then you can feel that you're part of this movement that's on every continent. And it gives joy, power. This is about our own personal health, both physical and mental, as well as healing the planet. And it may sound simplistic, it may sound unbelievable, but the more you study it, the more you will see it's true. And when it comes to study, I hope people will look out for a course that I've now recorded, which will be available soon. It's sort of a 6-week course that you could attend, because if you're interested in what I'm saying about the whole global versus local systemic paths, then we are the preeminent. We are the ones that I've been at it for 50 years, and we have an amazing array of voices from every continent. We have materials for a PhD on localization on our website, and we have so many wonderful voices, many of whom you won't have heard of, but you'll be very inspired and impressed with some of these voices.
Well, maybe our MBA can be a feeder school
Absolutely.
to the localization PhD.
Wonderful, yes. Or the other way, yeah.
Yes. Well, I'm so grateful for the work you're doing, and also the nuanced answer, even around gift economies. I feel like you really shared the foundation for why people need to hold themselves with a lot of self-compassion when they try to go out and be a part of a gift economy and realize it is so freaking hard.
Yes, and I love that you say that, because for me, one of the most important things from my international work is to say to people, please don't be too hard on yourself. Please don't allow the system to put all of that weight on your shoulders that you as an individual have to demonstrate a new system. You can't be a new culture. You can't be a new economy. You can't be a new system. You can contribute to it. And we've been cornered, particularly in the West, with this idea that we are responsible for the colonialism, the slavery, the expansion. No, we weren't. We inherited a system which led to world wars and all kinds of trauma. And I noticed you mentioned that on your website. We have intergenerational trauma. It comes from this system that we need to change. I had black and white experiences of that in Ladakh, Bhutan, and several other places. And so if we could realize that looking at this honestly and deeply is one of the best ways for us to regain greater joy, self-respect, personal health, as well as contributing to planetary healing. So it's a real win-win-win. And I'm saying that based on lots of experience on every continent, speaking 7 languages and seeing it again and again and again.
You're absolutely amazing. I have followed you for a long time as an economist that I admire, and this podcast is really affirming that. I wanted to say one more thing, which by the extension of the logic you just shared around this notion that we aren't responsible, but we've inherited these systems, I think there's an overcorrection that also happens by that same logic of we are responsible for fixing them. And we cannot think that way either, because it's not an individual thing to fix. We need to be communities fixing them together and not hold it as something, oh, I can be the savior or the hero and fix it myself. Thank you, Helena. Thank you so much for this conversation. We can't wait to keep the collaboration going.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you haven't gathered from our podcast already, we're really passionate about helping to build a future that works for all of us. If you share that passion and are looking to deepen your practice, we want to share a few ways to connect and learn directly with the Lyft Economy team. You've likely heard of the Next Economy MBA, which we started almost 10 years ago and have trained over 800 alumni through the fundamentals of business design from a regenerative and just perspective. New this year, our Next Economy Fund will embody our values of democratically allocating resources to Next Economy entrepreneurs that are part of our alumni network. We've also launched 2 trainings that came directly out of our MBA community's desire for more in-depth skill building around 2 key topics: organizational leadership and personal life design. Next Economy Leadership is a workshop series designed to help culture leaders at purpose-driven organizations move towards full embodiment of their values. And Next Economy Living is a 6-month training designed to help everyday citizens and consumers take actionable next steps to transform their local communities to align with a future that works for all of us. You can hear about all of these offerings and other ways we're supporting the Next Economy movement at lifteconomy.com/next steps. We deeply appreciate you being a listener of our show, especially in a cultural moment when attention and community are hard to come by. We're amazed by the community of folks we get to learn alongside through these offerings and hope you'll consider joining us.